Hello, hello, and let's begin by looking at the different ways to look into the brain, and then let's talk about sleep. All right, so we'll begin by looking at X-ray computed tomography, or CT scans. And this is where we look at the brain and look at the soft tissue and how it absorbs the different X-rays. And so these, you can observe the brain at different tissue depths, and so it's very important for clinicians. And then, so this is important for looking at different head regions and for treatments as to dizziness, also for severe headaches, bleeding to see if anybody's had a stroke, and also to detect brain tumors. All right, the next one that we'll look at is positron emission tomography, or PET scans. And these are when radioactively labeled fluorodeoxyglucose is injected into the blood, and it emits these gamma rays that are going to be expressed within active tissues. So this one is used to monitor cancers a lot to see how effective pharmacological agents are, as well as to study brain metabolism, primarily at how effective the brain is at utilizing glucose, looking at drug distribution within the brain, especially of new pharmacological agents, looking at changes in blood flow during activity. And so that's what we're actually seeing with this image here. So what's happening in the blood flow, like with walking, with when you see something versus when you hear it, think it, or remember it. All right, another recent use of PET scans are looking at differences in depressed versus non-depressed. And so the blue in this one represents a decrease in blood flow, and the increase here in what you see in the orange and yellows are due to an increase in blood flow to the brain. Magnetic resonance imaging, or MRIs, as they're very commonly known as, are when we have protons in tissues that are aligned in different magnets. And so this can be amplified by looking at contrast against agents that are injected. So the chemical composition of different tissues results in differences in proton alignments, is what we see when we're looking at an MRI scan. And so this shows a clear definition in this image between the gray matter, white matter, and then the cerebrospinal fluid, which it would be here, is where the CSF would be circulating. 5 minutes with an MRI can be useful in detecting Alzheimer's disease, multiple sclerosis, a stroke, schizophrenia, and an aneurysm. And so what we're seeing here in this image are differences between a schizophrenic patient. So this is the normal brain, and then this would be a schizophrenic brain. And a lot of this is due to an increase in ventricle size here that we see. Next one is functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, and this is to visualize an increase in neuronal activity in different brain regions by looking at blood flow. And so one of the neurotransmitters that helps with this is looking at glutamate, because it helps to increase vasodilation, which would increase the blood vessel size and area, allowing for more blood to flow. And so active brain regions receive more oxyhemoglobin, so more blood, and this is called the bold response for blood oxygenated level dependent contrast that we're seeing. So in this image, so if you listen to something versus if you only see something, this shows you how much blood flow and thus activation of these neurons are occurring. And so for those of you that just like to see things that are visual learners, well, you do have to have some auditory information as well. So like listening to my lectures are important, because here when you combine the two, you see that you're activating more regions of the brain. And so thus you'll be able to retain and remember information later on. All right, so the next one, which is a fairly new one, is a magnetic or magnetoencephalogram, or MEG. And this is based on magnetic fields that are produced by postsynaptic currents of action potentials. And so these are more accurate than electroencephalogram, which we'll talk about in the next slide. And so what you have is these different sensors that are put around your brain. And so they are these superconducting quantum interference devices that use magnetic coils and mathematical plots in representing which neurons are being activated and which ones are being deactivated or inhibited during different activities. So this electroencephalogram, EEG, these are when we have electrodes that are on the scalp, and they detect synaptic potentials that from cell bodies and dendrites in the cerebral cortex. And so this figure is showing a high number of electrodes. However, you can get around by just putting 3 different electrodes within the brain or on the scalp, and then it will be able to detect your different activities of the cell bodies. And so we use this method for detecting seizures, a lot of times for sleep disorders and for consciousness. And the big thing is because it's not invasive and you don't have to sit in like a magnetic box or something. This can just input into a computer. So now this leads us to sleep and looking at how we use an EEG, that electroencephalogram, in determining different wave patterns. All right, so we'll start with alpha waves. And so these are alpha waves here. These would be the recording from that EEG. And so alpha waves are going to predominate when somebody is active in a relaxed brain but eyes closed. So this is seen mostly within the occipital and parietal lobes, and so it's pretty cool that you can specify even what lobes that we visualize these in. Well, with these two, what we have are cycles, so the frequency is going to be 10 to 12 cycles per second, or it's going to be rather in hertz is going to be the measurement, okay? So the next one that we have are beta waves. So beta, here what we see in this figure. These are going to be when somebody is conscious and alert, and so they're going to be visually stimulated and have high mental activity. So this is when we see mostly in the frontal lobe, and beta waves have a higher frequency of about 13 to 25 hertz. Okay, then the next one are theta waves, which are that recording there. And so this is when we are sleeping, and this is mostly from the occipital and temporal lobe. So you can see a difference from the theta waves compared to the alpha and beta, where we'll have a slightly slower frequency, but we have a higher amplitude. And so this is going to be 5 to 8 cycles per second. And this is observed during our REM sleep. And REM sleep we'll get to in a moment, but rapid eye movement is what it stands for, and this is when we're dreaming. And so we'll have like lucid dreams that we can remember, and a barely conscious state just before going to sleep is when these are observed. All right, then the last one is our delta waves. And so that's in this graph here. And what you can see is that these are going to be even slower in frequency, but have a higher amplitude. So these are going to be during 1 to 5 hertz. Let's write that down there too. And these are observed during slow wave sleep. So this is when like the respiratory centers really slow down and your heart rate slows down during sleep. All right, so we talked about a little bit of the different cycles of sleep, so let's go in depth now more. So sleep is an interesting thing that, just like the rest of the brain, we still don't fully understand like the purpose of it, but we know it's important. And we found that it may be genetically controlled, although sleep is affected by environmental factors. There's a recent study actually that came out that people don't need to have so much sleep. Like some people can just get by on 3 to 4 hours of sleep a night, and it has to do with what genes are expressed. And so it's really interesting that whole 7 to 8 hours which we typically associate with how much sleep we need. Well, that might not be true for everybody. All right, so the two different types of sleep that we have are REM sleep and non-REM sleep. So REM stands for rapid eye movement, and this is when we have dreams occurring. Primarily, we see those theta waves, which are going to be a little bit slower in frequency than the alpha waves, however, and a little bit higher amplitude as well. So our limbic system is also very active during this, and so this is sometimes like why you can get very fearful if you're in a dream, or like with me during pregnancy, I actually like would wake up in tears because of such an intense dream that I had. Non-REM sleep, on the other hand, this is what's considered as resting sleep, and this is divided into 4 different stages, which we'll talk about next, and then we use the EEG to determine this, the electroencephalogram. So neurons slow down in their firing rate. So what we see then in the EEG then is that higher amplitude and very slow frequency. And so we start having a decrease in blood flow and energy metabolism. And with non-REM sleep, this is an important stage because this helps to allow repair of metabolic damage that's done to cells by free radicals that we're exposed throughout the day, and then also allows time for neuroplasticity mechanisms to store memories. And so it's important, like for instance, to get a good night's rest before an exam because you need that to help recall and retain that information better. Also, it helps to consolidate our memories as well. Again, it's very important for learning new content and material as well. So the stages of sleep, we cycle through these about 5 times per night, okay? And so this figure represents about 90-minute cycles, so times this about 5 on average for a typical person. All right, so here we're looking at an awake person, and what we're seeing is the recording on the EEG, and then level of consciousness, and then what type of sleep we're getting into. Okay, so the level of consciousness is detected by these different bars here, and then this here tells you what type of sleep, and then the EEG. Okay, so when we start out with non-REM sleep, we go into stage 1. So with stage 1, predominantly we'll have alpha waves that are observed, and this is when the muscles start to slow down, and then, but we still might get some occasional twitching, like 5 to 10 minutes as we're first starting to fall asleep. Then stage 2, we're starting to get into theta waves, but now we're decreasing our level of consciousness, and now we're into an intermediate type sleep. And so this is now when the body temperature starts to decrease, our breathing and our heart rate start to slow down. And then once we get into stage 3 and then into stage 4, we're entering now into having mostly delta waves, very low level of consciousness, and this is considered to be our slow wave sleep. Okay, so this is the transition now from light to deep sleep, and then so we're getting more rhythmic breathing and the limited muscle activity. Then we go into REM sleep, which is the next stage, and this is now where those vivid dreams start occurring. You have an increase in heart rate and then rapid and shallow breathing as compared to stage 3 and stage 4. And then we start having the beta waves predominate, and then you see too, we have a higher level of consciousness that occurs.